French champagne is rigidly produced and controlled, especially its labeling. An example of this is the fact that it is bottle fermented. The bubbles are allowed to form naturally in the bottle and not pumped in by some artificial device. This produces the best taste, but it is also very costly. In America, the law allows certain products to use the word champagne, but the requirements are so loose that it is easy to buy an inferior product. A good many American champagnes are fermented not in the bottle, but in huge vats. If the champagne is vat fermented, it must say bulk process on the label. However, this does not prevent some unscrupulous concern from saying naturally fermented by bulk process. The word natural is almost a contradiction here, but the unscrupulous concern relies on the equivocation of meaning and the buyer's natural gullibility. Analogy. This is a widely used technique. It will be useful to recall our previous distinction between literal and figurative analogies. A literal analogy is a claim that if two things are alike in one or more respects, then they are alike in some further respect. A figurative analogy is thus a dramatic device for emphasizing or explaining one point. A good deal of advertising relies upon the obscurity over this distinction. What are figurative analogies are presented as literal analogies. An American sports-type car, which is relatively inexpensive, is called the Ferrari of American cars. Ferrari is a prestigious automobile that is both expensive and a masterpiece of technology. It may be that the only similarity, and certainly not an analogy, between Ferrari and the American car is some slight styling feature, yet advertising capitalizes on this. Another American automobile claims to be quieter inside than a Rolls-Royce. This is probably true, but that is probably the beginning and the end of any superiority. Driving home the conclusion. Advertising does not rely upon complicated arguments. Its stock in trade is repetition. Of the devices it employs under this general head, the most important are emotive language and the promise of residual benefits. In his book, The Hidden Persuaders, Vance Packard emphasizes the subliminal promise that goes along with each product. As one man put it, the cosmetic manufacturers are not selling lanolin, they are selling hope. We do not just buy an automobile, we buy prestige. Although a bit overemphasized, there is a real point here. If a man does not feel the need for an automobile, it is not likely that you will sell him one. On the other hand, given human nature, the market for automobiles and competitors that are very similar technically to your product, some residual benefit must be offered. So you say that anyone can buy a car of brand X, but if someone buys your brand, he not only gets a car, but he gets a symbol of virility as well. The connection between cars and sex cannot just be invented by advertisers. There must already be some connection in the minds of the audience. Sociologically, we may note that this particular connection between cars and sex is the result of the fact that courtship habits have changed a great deal over the past 50 years precisely because of the existence of cars. The greatest example of emotive language, so clever that it is almost unbelievable, is an advertisement not for any specific product but for brand names. It simply says you can rely upon brand names. Here you are being conditioned to respond to the advertising itself or to conditioning itself. Amazing. Some brands have actually achieved a kind of super status. Scotch tape is not just a brand in the popular mind, but has become the generic term used by consumers of cellophane tape. The same is true of Kleenex in the case of facial tissue. With some such emotive status, it is unlikely that competitors will have any chance. We can all learn a great deal from advertising. Attacking an argument. There are two main reasons for learning techniques of attacking arguments. First, one can build a stronger case for his own position if, in addition to presenting positive considerations for it, he shows that there are serious weaknesses in the arguments of his rivals. Remember in this connection that few positions of practical importance can be conclusively proved. Thus, while you are not likely to be able to prove your own position, you can make it look very good indeed by punching holes in the arguments of the opposition. Second, once you have mastered the art of offense, you will undoubtedly become more sophisticated in defense of your original position. Anticipating what and where the attacks against you will originate and how they might progress is half the battle. Audience reaction. Before you do anything else, you must gauge audience reaction to the original presentation of your opponent's case. There are three possible reactions. Either your opponent has been successful in varying degrees in persuading the audience to adopt his point of view, or 2, the audience remains undecided, or 3, your opponent has been unsuccessful in varying degrees in getting the audience to accept his case. Let us discuss general strategy with respect to these 3 possibilities, reversing the order of consideration. If your opponent has been unsuccessful, the first thing you must do is to pinpoint precisely those spots in his presentation that were the weakest and least successful with the audience. Then concentrate most of your fire on these spots, thereby reinforcing in the minds of the audience the weakness of his position and your brilliance in sharing their perceptiveness. Here you are combining a critique of the opposition with flattery of the audience. Next, when you feel that the audience is with you, you may proceed to employ the techniques and rules to be discussed below, and you may do so with humor and ridicule. Please note, humor and ridicule are effective against an opponent only if you know yourself to be preeminent in the eyes of the present audience. Otherwise, you will offend all concerned. There are 2 special devices that should be used in a blatant manner in those cases where you are sure your opponent has been unsuccessful. These devices are the ad hominem attack and the genetic fallacy. Ad hominem. To attack ad hominem is to attack the man who presents an argument rather than the argument itself. There are some subtle variations of it that you will discover throughout this chapter, but here we are concerned only with its most blatant use. There are 2 occasions during a discussion when you may use it, either after you have demolished the argument by independent means, or in those cases where your opponent's argument has been so unsuccessful with the audience that it is not worth demolishing. This is important. There are no doubt, as you shall see, all sorts of clever things you can do, but these things should be done only if needed to win. If you can win without using a technique, do not use it. You may distract both yourself and the audience. There are various ways of attacking a man. You might begin by chastising him for insulting the intelligence of the audience by offering such a shabby case, or you may explain why he has adopted such a foolish view. Examples of ad hominem include the following. When asked to debate a particular subject with his students, a teacher may reply that he does not discuss such serious matters with a bunch of ignoramuses. Or a speaker invited to the campus by students may refuse to answer the questions of his academic audience by noting that they have not read a particular writer or have not read a particular book or magazine article. The point of ad hominem is to discredit the opposition in indirect ways. One way of doing this is to call attention to infelicities in your opponent's use of the English language. That is, if there are errors in grammar, diction, or just poor choice of metaphors or the mixing of metaphors, call attention to it. The implication is that if a person mixes his metaphors, then his mind must be in a state of confusion, and if his mind is confused, then we do not have to take him seriously. One traditional error is called amphiboly, and it is the result of sentence structure. For example, there is the famous case of the pharmacist who had a sign in his window that read, "We dispense with accuracy." Would you trust the pharmacist to fill your prescription if he did not know how to express his thoughts clearly?
This concludes Tape 1. Please insert Tape 2 to continue.
Genetic fallacy. The most sophisticated form of ad hominem is a special kind of counter-argument itself, namely the genetic fallacy. To explain genetically is to describe the origin of an event, process, thing, or what have you. It is a kind of historical account of how things got that way. Genetic explanations are certainly valid and useful in other contexts, but they are especially useful in undermining an opponent. Perhaps the 2 most famous uses of genetic explanation are Freudian psychoanalysis and various forms of Marxism. The anxieties, neuroses, and psychoses of many patients are identified as the result of a course of development that began in childhood. Usually some traumatic experience in childhood is the cause of the neurosis. For example, being locked in a closet as punishment might cause claustrophobia. Marxists can explain, so they claim, not only the history of economic development, but why it exhibits certain patterns, such as boom and bust, and why some workers feel alienated in the Capaldi